Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I think for me, this sort of follows on from a session we did with Optimum back earlier in the summer in June as one of the Bio Wednesdays around ESG and life science investment, which I don't think it is a new term, but it still feels like it's new to many of us who don't fully understand what the expectations or requirements may be. And maybe because it's kind of been to some degree shielded from the sort of radar of private early stage companies, thinking this was the domain of larger companies having to report. And one of the things that came out of that earlier session was about how often investors are looking at private companies that they're considering investing in from the venture or private equity side and making assessments of their ESG credentials and rating, and maybe not even without telling those companies. So that prompted a number of questions. And it wasn't just investors, it was maybe R&D partners or purchasers from your supply chain. So it kind of raised a number of questions about, well, what is best practice or good practice? What can companies be doing to make sure they remain attractive to investors and larger partners? And equally, I guess more and more, it's about setting out their stall in the minds of the top talent they want to recruit, because we hear increasingly about employees at all levels are looking for companies that have the same alignment of values and how they want to be seen as a corporate citizen, that are attracting really good and retaining good people. So I'm really pleased this morning, actually, that one of the panelists from that session, who's dealt with investor relations for a long time, Lindsay Stewart, has agreed to come back and have this session and talk really about some of those matters, about what companies should expect, what they can be doing, how it gets interpreted sometimes. I'm sure there'll be questions around that, and what weighting do investors put towards it in your experience. We were chatting beforehand about maybe what some of the changing dynamics are and whether the pandemic has influenced that, or whether it's geographies or trends. So Lindsay's going to present or talk to camera for the first 20 minutes or so, just setting the scene around this. And then it'll be an open Q&A for any questions you got but were maybe too afraid to ask in the past. Now's your chance. So I would encourage people to put them into the chat box. We'll try and get everybody involved if we can. And I'll look forward to the interactive bit. But for now, Lindsay, over to you.
Tony, thank you for that introduction. Absolutely fantastic to be back here speaking to a One Nucleus about environmental, social, and governance themes in investing, ESG themes. It's a term that I certainly have heard a lot in the last few years. I'm sure all of you have heard plenty of it as well. So quick introduction to me. I'm Lindsay Stewart. Current role is I'm the head of stakeholder for the Financial Reporting Council. Only been in that role around 8 weeks. Prior to that, I was a Big Four accounting firm helping them deal with these issues, and particularly helping them establish their presence with investors, particularly on the audit side, helping people recognize that basically the audit is set up to serve investors, and we had to consider both, the financial considerations and sort of the non-financial ones, as they're called, things like ESG and sustainability matters increasingly. Most of my career, I've been an investor relations consultant, as Tony mentioned. I dealt with companies of all sizes listed in the UK, very much a public equity perspective. Also in continental Europe, I did quite a lot of work in Central Europe, helping other companies there understand who their investors were, what their perspectives were on strategy, on management, on performance and valuation. I also have a bit of a history in technical accounting matters, kind of bringing that investor perspective to major new standards that were implemented over the last 5 years. And as an aside, I was also recently nominated as a finalist in the Black British Business Awards, which will be held next week. So there's that happening as well. A bit about the Financial Reporting Council, the FRC, who I work for. We're the UK's national financial reporting and audit regulator and owner of best practice codes for corporate governance and investment stewardship. So there's quite a lot of work that I've done recently on helping investors who wanted to sign up to our stewardship code understand exactly what the changed requirements were that we put through there. The FRC works in the public interest, mostly in the interest of investors and other key stakeholders who rely on high quality risk management, reporting and auditing. And when I say investors, I think it's important to remind everybody that investors are not just, your fund managers suited and booted sat in the city of London or in Canary Wharf or wherever they happen to be. The society that we're in means that basically we're all investors. Savings, pensions, they're all put into the stock market or into private markets to generate a return. So this is kind of something that does affect everybody. And that stakeholder base that I have to deal with in my role is I'm discovering incredibly broad. And so it's a good challenge kind of widening out from that public equity investor perspective into how does this affect everybody else, companies, the broader public interest. So naturally, we've got a strong interest in those environmental, social, and governance themes that the market is interested in. Just a couple of notes. In my role as Head of Stakeholder Engagement, I'm going to be focusing in this talk on the sort of stakeholder and particularly investor perspective on ESG. So I'm not going to be here to explain FRC policy in depth. Somebody else would be in this chair speaking about that if that were the case. And in particular, there won't be any discussion on any enforcement or supervision activities carried out by the FRC. Nature of my role is I find out about those at the same time as everybody else anyway. So yeah, let's get into that. So just as Tony mentioned, following up from a great One Nucleus panel that we had in June, we had various perspectives, one from an institutional investor, one from established corporates, head of sustainability there, some growth company perspectives, not-for-profit perspectives, just a bit of a run through of how stakeholder views have developed. And so I'm just going to carry on that conversation a bit. Just explaining exactly what's the same and what's changed on the various areas. And previously, I'd communicated 6 key areas that investors and stakeholders were interested in on the ESG side. And it's amazing how persistent those 6 key areas are actually proving to be. The themes and discussion points around those areas are changing, all of the time, but underlying themes are kind of remaining pretty constant. And I'm kind of happy to give a reminder on what those things are now. So here are the 6. Number 1, particular focus on climate and increasingly natural capital biodiversity issues. Investors want meaningful disclosure on the risks and opportunities and costs and how the company strategy relates to that. Number 2 is the S factor in ESG, the social or societal matters. Investors are expecting a much greater focus in those areas. Number 3 is the reporting frameworks that many of you will have heard about. And as Tony mentioned, there's increasing demand for information on how companies are fitting into those various frameworks. Investors want to focus on greater materiality, and we'll dig into that in a second. Speaking of the various frameworks, there are a lot of them around. I'm sure many of you will have noticed if you looked into that. Investors and stakeholders in particular want a convergence in those frameworks. We want these things to kind of thin out into consistent global standards. And then 5 and 6, data quality and assurance are increasingly important to those investors. And there's that emphasis, number 6, on transparency and consistency. So let's just dig into that first point very quickly on climate. You can't fail to have noticed that companies have made many claims about how they're going to address the climate issue. There's a lot of talk about net zero in 2040, 2050, and so on. The question that's increasingly being asked is, hey, companies, what happens between now and 29 years from now? There's a lot that can go right or wrong for companies between now and then. So what's happening? I'm sure you'll remember the IPCC report a few weeks ago, which I'll paraphrase as saying, if you're reading this, it's too late. What they were saying is that at this point, 1.5 degrees of global warming is pretty much a certainty given the path that we're on. And so it's interesting how often it needs that the reminder needs to be given that we're not really dealing with climate in a sort of yes/no fashion. We're not deciding whether we're going to have climate change or not. We are going to have it. The discussion is, how bad are we prepared to let it get? How bad are we prepared to allow it to get? So increasingly, investors are thinking, have companies recognized the reality of all of that? Are they integrating within their strategy meaningful targets on climate? What are the waypoints between now and 2040 or 2050? What are the steps they're going to take? Because there's not a lot of credibility in suggesting, yes, we're going to be net zero sometime in the next decade or the decade after, if what your plan appears to be is, we're going to get to 2049 and then just switch everything off. It simply doesn't work that way. Investors want meaningful disclosures on goals and strategy and interim targets in line with what are known as science-based initiatives. Increasingly also, not just on climate, but also there's a focus on nature and biodiversity. Plenty of you will have noticed that there is a big conference being planned in Glasgow called COP26 in November. What has got a lot less attention is that there is another COP happening in the middle of next month on biodiversity. That's going to be in China. Nature and biodiversity has kind of been bubbling under the surface, and unless you're particularly been paying attention to chatter among institutional investors, and no reason why any of you should necessarily have done so, you will have noticed that investors are confident that climate is being taken seriously, and it is, by policymakers, by governments, by regulators. Nature and biodiversity still needs a bit of a push. And so that's what they're starting to communicate and focus on, is exactly what steps are companies making in those areas. What disclosure frameworks do we need? And there's an initiative called the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, that's kind of just ramping up its activity to kind of help impose that rigor in disclosures. So it's just something that increasingly organizations, and particularly those wanting to raise capital or maintain relationships with their investors, will need to pay attention to. So that's the first point, climate and biodiversity. The second point that I mentioned, the S in ESG, the social or societal factors. Investors that I've spoken to frequently mention that second factor, the S in ESG, as the lost dimension or the forgotten middle child of ESG. And I see where that perspective comes from. It's always often a case that there's this focus on climate over and above everything else, and then everything else kind of gets relegated to sort of a secondary status sometimes. However, in terms of calling it the forgotten middle child, it's sometimes it feels a little bit ivory tower, if you'll pardon the expression. The people who are affected by those social or societal factors, be that sort of human rights, fair treatment in the workplace, access to basic resources, pay gaps, workforce engagement, socioeconomic inclusion. It's a very broad span. The people affected by those don't actually have the luxury of being able to forget about them, which is why the investors are increasingly prioritizing those things, particularly amid the pandemic. And quite of that is translated into focusing what the life sciences and pharmaceutical sector is doing. It's also a matter of debate, but if we've got until 2050 for climate, and many people believe that we do we really have that long for matters of a social aspect? You'll notice that, the social and political zeitgeist is pretty impatient with some of the things that are covered in those in those topics. So, do we have that long to sort it out? Investors are increasingly recognizing that it is a priority to actually have, for companies to actually have strategies in those areas. So amid the pandemic, investors took a look at companies and they said, okay, fine, there's a global health crisis, 2020, 2021, pretty much written off in their investment plans, but they've been increasingly looking forward, 2022, 23, 24, right through to the middle of the decade, thinking, okay, which companies are going to succeed in this environment? And increasingly, they're starting to consider things that wouldn't necessarily have come across the table of a portfolio manager or analyst, like what is the purpose or culture or values of particular companies. One that will particularly affect this sector is, do talented people actually want to work for you? You might have heard the words great resignation recently. So investors are starting to think very, very seriously about companies' access to talent. Can they attract and retain the people that they need to execute on their strategy? So as much as a lot of people will say, I'm all about business, that whole value alignment and cultural alignment, that is a business matter. Without naming any names, but there was recent discussion over one company in the healthcare sector, British listed company, that was in the middle of an acquisition by a company that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily associate with healthcare. And if you think about the conversations that came out of that, discussing whether they'd be able to hang on to their workforce, whether they'd have access to the networks of expertise that they'd previously relied on. That's kind of an illustration of exactly the kind of things that investors are starting to think about with regard to how companies' purpose and culture and values and strategy are all aligned to kind of help them generate returns. It's really become a key business issue. So if you don't have a strategy for those social or societal factors, then it's true to say that you don't actually have a strategy at all. It really does require some serious thought. So moving on to the third point, that materiality focus. Materiality is a word that is subject to endless chin-stroking debates in the reporting and investor communications world. I mean, having come from an audit firm recently, materiality had a very narrow meaning. It's had a purely financial meaning, and like we're starting to expand away from that. And what investors are thinking of materiality are not just what affects the numbers, what affects the bottom line at the end of the year, but anything that can meaningfully influence a company's strategy, its business outcomes, its performance, its valuation, both in terms of sort of perception in the market as well as the hard numbers, is material. And so what investors want is material information of an ESG nature. What they want is to find out what will really cause an inflection in a company's performance, be that for better or worse. What are the risks and opportunities to those numbers? So increasingly, they're impatient with volumes of boilerplate Me Too disclosures. Like, as an example that I've heard in one conversation, you know, how much paper, how many million pages of A4 are being recycled, how many tons of waste are being sent to compost instead of landfill. Don't get me wrong, all of that is valuable and important, but an investor's decision isn't going to hinge on that unless you are a recycling or a composting company, right? So increasingly, they want companies to look at their strategy and think, for what's about to come in the areas of ESG, on climate, on biodiversity, on social factors, is this company well positioned, and how will I know that from the disclosures that are being given? It does take some serious thought by those responsible for strategy and those responsible for reporting. Increasingly, there are two particular frameworks, and if you'll pardon the acronyms, there's TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, that are considered by investors to be those particularly materiality-focused metrics. SASB in particular has a materiality map where you can look up exactly what is considered material by investors in each sector, so that you can help hone your disclosures towards exactly what they're looking for. Interestingly, the TCFD and SASB frameworks have also been recommended by my organization, the FRC, as ones that companies should increasingly look to report in line with. So moving on to that fourth point, the convergence in frameworks. There's a lot of talk about the alphabet soup. There are a lot of metrics around. I just mentioned two of them, TCFD and SASB, but there's also GRI, there's integrated reporting, the CDP, CDSB, the WEF, IBC metrics, and so on and so forth. And you will notice there's a bit of a record collection behind me. If we've got any Nile Rodgers fans in the house, what investors increasingly want is soup for one. They want one organization to come in and kind of harmonize all of these various frameworks and make one set of globally relevant, investment-focused sustainability metrics. And that's the work that's going on now. I'm just going to bring up a graphic quickly. This was issued late last year, and this was 5 of the organizations who had banded together to, they put out a statement of intent to work together. CDSB, SASB, Integrated Reporting Council, GRI, and they've published this paper explaining exactly how everything should fit together. And what's happened since all of this has come on is the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, the IFRS Foundation, has put out a consultation on bringing this all together to form an International Sustainability Standards Board, an ISSB, to kind of harmonize all of those investor relevant reporting standards and bring out one set of global standards. They're starting with climate first, And that group of 5 that I just mentioned had put out a prototype climate standard, which might be useful in informing that project. But the ISSB is not intending to deal with climate alone. The IFRS Foundation is in the process of setting that up, and they're aiming to announce a launch around the time of COP26 in November, but we're still seeing how that will progress. But a lot of investors are putting hopes on the IFRS Foundation's work to start really harmonizing that alphabet soup down into one consistent global framework. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on there. And just dealing with the last 2 points quickly, increasingly there's concern over data quality and assurance because companies have not got decades-long processes in the way they have financial reporting to collect and consistently report ESG-related data on climate, on biodiversity, on various factors. It's often the case that the quality or even the availability of data isn't always there, and increasingly, because these disclosures are so material to investment decisions, they increasingly want external assurance over what's being provided. So that's a space that we're going to have to watch develop, and there are plenty of organizations that are doing work in improving in those areas. And the final point is on transparency and consistency, is that it's often a criticism from investors, not just on ESG, but across corporate reporting, that transparency and consistency hasn't really been there, even internally throughout the same reports. So what they want is a real focus on delivering that value relevant information in a transparent and consistent way across the piece. One key evolution in the conversation on ESG recently is that there's increasingly been some skeptical voices that have kind of been out in the market on the value of ESG to the overall transition to building back better, to use the common phrase, to addressing climate, to addressing social issues, things like that. You know, are we just implementing processes, or are we actually creating impact? Some names that you might mention, that you might have heard of are, for example, Tariq Fancy, formerly of BlackRock, the world's largest investment manager, who had questioned some of the elements of ESG. Is it actually just a way for investors to sell more investment products, or is it actually making the difference that there is in the world? And then some, you know, there are various other skeptical voices that have kind of arisen. I do want to say that hearing those questions is actually a good thing. Having that debate over, you know, are we actually implementing process, or are we actually delivering impact? It is actually valuable to have those conversations. And yes, there are some difficult questions that the investment industry does have to answer on the validity of their ESG products. Completely a good thing. However, that doesn't mean that companies can kind of ease off the pedal with regard to actually getting prepared for these things. The ESG integration in the investing process, it's a real thing. It isn't going away. And companies that aren't ready to kind of give the right disclosures in those 6 areas that I mentioned are going to find themselves at a disadvantage when it comes to raising capital, or whether it comes to maintaining relations with their investors when they need to raise capital in the future, or just keeping them on side to maintain the valuations of their company. It doesn't mean that anybody gets to sit back. It's not just a chin stroking discussion. Actual go, no-go funding decisions are being made on those factors. So while it is interesting to kind of watch the debate and think about the impact that ESG is making, it doesn't mean that anybody can sit back and relax. ESG is definitely here to stay. So those are all my prepared comments. I'm happy to take a few questions if everybody's ready. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. And I think now we've got plenty of time for just open Q&A, I think, as I phrased it before. So anybody who feels bold enough to put their cameras on always feels a bit more welcoming than just looking at the names. I think that makes you feel a bit more interactive, perhaps. But I guess whilst that's happening, we've got Mike Fletcher with his hand up. Mike.
Thanks, Tony. This might sound an odd question, but one of the reasons why I was interested in joining this discussion was we're a charity. We've kind of in the past gone off the idea that, well, ESG is more for quoted companies. It's not something a charity necessarily does. So is this something that, you know, are we off piste? Are charities starting to use the ESG structure to report, or is this still more of a what's the word? More of a PLC type of approach?
Thanks, Mike. That's a very interesting question. Yeah, I will say that the ESG it's very suited to sort of the public company paradigm, purely because like those are where the largest companies reside, and that's where it will have the most impact, right? However, I think the fact that it has that paradigm is that it means that the language of ESG becomes a lot better understood by all of your stakeholders. And obviously charities, they need funding like any other organization. It certainly isn't going to be a waste of time to start thinking along those lines in terms of, what is our environmental impact? What in particular is our social impact? What are we trying to achieve? What's our purpose? What's our culture? What are our values? How does that align to our strategy? What disclosures do our stakeholders need? Certainly doesn't hurt. So although it will need a very, very different spin to it, because sort of the ESG debate that we've mostly been having has been focused on how do we cater to investors that are seeking a financial return on their capital while not destroying the planet. You'll need to modify that somewhat to think about, okay, what is the impact that you need for your stakeholders? But it certainly is a useful way to frame your conversations with your own stakeholders, for sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Leonidas, got a question here? Do you want to come on camera and ask it?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I wanted to ask if you could expand a bit on the SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and in particular, what benchmarks can be used to assess progress in SFDR, in these metrics of the SFDR.
I'm afraid I'm not an SFDR expert, so I would need to take that one away.
Thanks a lot. But in general, how do companies benchmark their progress in whatever ESG metric they are using?
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Companies are generally looking across their own sectors, and I think the SASB is particularly useful in helping investors and companies understand what's material in their own areas. So where we've previously had, companies each looking to the side, one company in one sector will look across to their peers and say, what are they disclosing? And so that's kind of where we ended up with a lot of Me Too disclosures, in which you get a lot of disclosure of things that aren't necessarily important to the business. And increasingly, it's a case of taking a particular look at your own strategy, your own business model, both now and in the future, and thinking, what exactly do investors want to hear about now? What are the growth areas, and what disclosures are going to be useful in the future? And then providing that transparent and consistent disclosure over all of those areas. So in terms of benchmarking, because it's such an evolving area, looking towards the past at what's already been done, it's a useful exercise, but it might not necessarily involve what you're going to need to do. So it's just really a case of having that forward look and that strategic focus, and thinking about, what's material to the investors I have now? Who do I want to attract? What do my broader stakeholders think about it? How will it affect my access to talent, in particular, as you mentioned in those S and ESG metrics? Those kinds of questions will help you get to good answers on those benchmarks.
I see. James, if I could come to you, because I've got a question to direct at you, as well as seeing your question in the chat.
To direct at me, okay.
I guess I was just curious, when you advise on some pretty meaty transactions in terms of investment rounds and acquisitions and so forth, what are you seeing in terms from an investor or the corporate side in terms of ESG? Is that coming into the transaction discussion more and more, and that side? And then happy to go with your question about international standards and travel.
It is, Tony. I mean, we're seeing it more and more. For those who don't know me, I'm a partner at Mills & Reeve, and I head the firm's life sciences practice. And I think we're seeing it in a number of different different areas. We're seeing it in terms of what do organisations need to do, and I agree, Lindsay. One of the key issues is it's all pervasive, and so getting your arms around it and getting a coherent strategy, because it touches so many different areas, is a real challenge. So yeah, businesses will sort of say, well, actually, what do they need to have in place? Yes, Tony, we are seeing it in an investment sense. I mean, where we're getting involved is probably further down the line in terms of a decision has been made by an investment committee to invest. But clearly, it's becoming a much more important focus for potential investors. I think one of the reasons I sort of raised the question, Lindsay, is actually one of the challenges for us is actually how you then embed that within contracts, whether that's sort of an investment agreement, or actually increasingly more common in terms of things like supply agreements and things like that, and the sorts of standards and benchmarks that you're then contractually required to meet. So we're sort of seeing it in a number of different areas. If that's useful as a bit of a bit of input in terms of what we're starting to see, Tony.
Yes, but Lindsay, I know direction of travel internationally.
The thing is, I think it's all a bit of an adventure. We've got these decades-long processes and conceptual frameworks and standards for financial reporting, and even up until very recently, the powers that be haven't expressed a particularly great need or a particularly great deal of interest in setting similar standards for things like, climate or wider ESG issues up until last year. And then there's suddenly been this flurry of activity. And so they're kind of running full speed to set everything up. But it's just becoming clear that we still don't have really a conceptual framework or an initial standard. There are ideas, there are prototypes out there, and there are existing voluntary frameworks. But in terms of a mandatory framework that is backed by statute, all of that's quite new. So what we know is that we're going to have a focus on climate to begin with. They will put all their effort into coming up with a climate disclosure standard that is investor focused, that is enterprise value focused, first of all. Exactly what's in and out of that, we've got some ideas, and the prototype standard that the group of 5 issues will be a good starting point, and the IFRS Foundation has indicated that they will build on that work, and I'm happy to put a link in the chat as soon as I get a second to where that is. But past that, the IFRS Foundation has said, yes, we recognize that climate first is the priority, but it's not going to be climate alone. There's a broad slate of ESG disclosures that need to be catered to. And on that, we're just going to have to see how the framework develops. We're still very, very much at the start of the road on that. And it's kind of hard to see how that's going to develop over time. But it'll be good to see us get started within the next few months. Fingers crossed that everything goes smoothly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm conscious, we've seen of late, we've seen companies announcing going public in London. We've seen companies, UK companies now saying going to go to NASDAQ. In terms of the weighting that investors and going through the IPO process, where the weighting will be applied, if you like, would you expect it to be a difference between US and between New York and London in terms of how hot a topic this is and how it's assessed?
There's always a difference, and it's quite a broad difference in perspective between the United States and London. I'm always fascinated to observe it, because the reason why quite a lot of companies are going to sort of NASDAQ or New York is partly because of that perspective. And that's subject to some consultation, particularly by the Treasury on, what do we need to change about the listing rules to kind of keep those companies over this side of the Atlantic. But I feel, personal opinion, that there is a bit of a difference in perspective between sort of UK institutional investors and US ones, is that UK investors, they do like profitable companies that make reliable cash flows and dividends. And like some of the largest companies present in London are a reflection of that, right? Which doesn't necessarily work so well for that early stage growth tech and science perspective. And so often they're going off to the United States, where there is a lot more tolerance for a company staying unprofitable for 10, sometimes 20 years, and then suddenly going vertical. So that perspective really does make a difference. And like, I hope we can kind of get that patient capital mentality over here in London quite a bit more. But yeah, that's kind of part of it. And so in terms of the ESG thinking, the ESG thinking is thought to be quite a lot more advanced over here in the UK and in continental Europe, partly because there is that greater exposure to large, highly established companies outside of sort of the tech and growth sciences sectors. So there's a lot more focus on sort of, you know, processes and disclosures, whereas in the United States, they're sort of trying to kind of get into that mentality away from, okay, how do we kind of pivot away from pure financial metrics into more sustainability topics? And some of the largest investors have been very much in that mentality, but then some of the growth investors are just thinking about, okay, how do we tackle this challenge? Because obviously it's getting to a point where it's entered the public psyche so much that it starts to affect valuation and perceptions of companies if they're not doing anything on that. And so yeah, there is that difference in perspective, but I hope that's kind of a bit of a useful flavor of where those differences can arise.
And again, it's a kind of perspective thing. So I'm hogging the questions, and unless someone wants to jump in, you shout at me by all means. But it's a sort of a perspective as well. I mean, we've seen life sciences be put in the spotlight as a result of the pandemic, and I hear lots of sort of movements from investors who traditionally haven't been in life sciences. Perhaps now that we're seeing things like diagnostics, manufacturing, different business models come through and different drivers. Do those investors perhaps coming in from other sectors, you know, has ESG been more prominent or less prominent in other sectors outside of life sciences in your view?
Compared to prior to the pandemic? I think pretty much across the board that ESG perspective has been heightened, partly by the focus on climate and by the pandemic, just the various effects that people weren't really keeping an eye on that they suddenly are right in front of them. And so, yeah, I'd say in particular, the life sciences sector, there's kind of been a bit of a change in mentality in that people are asking different questions. Like life sciences was seen as a very, quite rightly, as a very responsible investment friendly area. But that now increasingly questions are being asked about, you know, what about access to medicines? What about trial safety? What about cost of supplying medicines? What are governments paying for access to medicines? They're asking a lot more incisive questions about the life sciences sector in those areas. And I think that's definitely something that those running those organizations will need to be prepared to answer those difficult questions on particularly those social aspects. And I think I mentioned the SASB materiality map earlier. That's kind of where SASB has focused its attention within the life sciences and pharmaceutical sectors. They say, yes, climate is important. There are disclosures that everyone's going to expect on sort of those climate and environmental issues, but it's really in those social factors that that SASB, that framework owner, is expecting those really material disclosures and granular disclosures on exactly how those factors intersect with the strategies that companies have.
Any other questions? I'm going to say from the floor, but from the screen perhaps would be a more accurate question.
Sorry, yeah. Dan, hi. Yeah, perhaps I could just jump in with something a little bit left field, but hopefully that's welcome here.
See how it goes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. You know, Lindsay, first of all, thanks. It's been a great talk, and you know, I really enjoyed your June one as well. I think, yeah, you know, you deliver it so well. I wonder if I could just ask how you see, you know, from talking to investors, where, you know, what's their priority, or how do they balance thinking about investing in E versus against in S? Obviously that they're not mutually exclusive, and you know, I think certainly to have a positive impact on the environment, you need to be aware of and helping to improve so many social issues. So it's not to say they're mutually exclusive, not at all. But yeah, I just wondered if you had a sense from the investing field, let's say, on how they prioritize the two, how they invest in both, how the climate crisis kind of urgency, how that figures into it against urgency of social issues. It's a bit of a vague one, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts to be interesting to hear.
Sure, happy to answer that. I'll firstly say that's not a left field question. That's the question. It's very central to all of this. And I'll discourage people from thinking of the ESG in silos. They are all very, very interconnected, and that's how investors are considering it. It's if you're taking action on the E, for example, if you're taking action on the environment, there are certain infrastructure would need to be built, certain decisions would need to be taken, certain activities might need to be closed, certain new ones might need to be open. All of those things are going to affect communities, which puts you right in the S strand of ESG. And then if you think about where perceived failures on the E&S happen, whether there's, I don't know, river pollution, environmental pollution, failure to act on climate change, inequalities in the workplace, whatever it is, E or S issues, every E or S failure has to have a G failure associated with it, that governance side. Something has to have gone wrong in governance for those things to fail as well. So it's all very connected. And that's how investors are starting to look at these things in total. They're thinking again about, hate to repeat myself all the time, about what's material to each business and how those intersections add up to risks and opportunities. And then their investment managers will do what they do. They'll find a way to price those opportunities, value companies, and decide who should be bought or who should be sold.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks very much for that.
Just sort of thinking through, I mean, going back probably a decade or more than a decade now, when sort of the green agenda was rising in the city and certainly within the corporates. There was lots of finger pointing at the time of what was greenwashing and wasn't real, and that come from, well, we could just buy our way out of it by offsetting rather than actually reducing what we were doing. We just plant a lot more trees or whatever it might be, which I guess isn't the goal if we really want to get reduction. But equally, is the same parallel there where until the standards are put about what's measured and reported, there's the danger under the ESG side. There's an awful lot of ESG washing as opposed to greenwashing. Maybe I'm just old and cynical.
No, that's right on the button. That is the biggest issue in ESG at the moment is, what's real and what's not. Who's talking a good game and who's playing one. And we've heard that both on the investment management side and on the company side is like, are companies disclosing, firstly, is the quality of the data there? Is there that consistency? Are companies giving that transparency that is needed to make informed decisions about their performance on climate, environment, social factors, all of those things? And where will companies be going with that next? It's really, really important to kind of have that consistent material disclosure. And that's why investors are so very focused on materiality, rather than just judging a company by how much they're prepared to disclose, whether it's material or not. What's actually important to the strategy? Do you have the right people on your board to actually consider and deal effectively with those matters? And connected to that, that's why they're insisting that we need actual standards that have statutory backing on a global basis, so that there's that consistency between various reports over time and between peers, and to ensure that there are actually consequences for those who are not living up to what they've been disclosing.
So I guess that's the sort of auditing part of it, in a sense of, is it real, is going to be key. But I guess if it, we talked a little bit about the US side, but what does that mean if you look towards China and you look east for investment? What's kind of going on there?
It's an interesting question. It's not one I have a great deal of insight into. And I guess a lot will depend on, what happens with COP26. It's like that's supposed to be the focal point at which the world comes together to decide exactly what is our plan of action for dealing with these things. And things will, eventually the standards will have to stem from what's being decided there. But yeah, the investors are very clear that there does need to be coordinated and consistent global action on this. So we'll just have to wait and see whether we get it. Let's hope we do.
So I guess there is the chance that investors will perhaps want to go to the systems where there are standards and consistency just from their own standing in that. I guess their investors, if you like, their partners are going to want to see that they're adhering to.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, that's very true.
So it might drive
very
that.
True.
And this may be even more left field than anything else has come out. But I'm just thinking in terms of, the smaller life science companies who are starting out and they're still private and maybe going to go through rounds of private capital. When's the right time to start measuring these things? I mean, is there a time where it's too soon, where it takes up disproportionate resource for the benefit? Or are investors at every stage likely to be looking at this? There might be something that even maybe the Optimum guys on their investor relations have a view on.
I mean, that's an interesting question. And it's something that isn't very well known to me because I've had quite a long, large public equity focus. However, what I do know is a lot of mostly public equity focused institutions are increasingly moving into private markets because there are so few, there's not actually a lot of new issuance on public markets, and they do need to still satisfy investment returns for the mandates that investors have given them. And so increasingly some of that money is going into private markets, and they are going to be expecting similar disclosures above a certain threshold from companies or private equity portfolios that the preferences of the beneficiaries of those investment vehicles, which increasingly are ESG focused, are going to be met by those investments. So there's always a judgment to be taken, particularly for smaller companies, as to how much time and resources and expertise needs to go into delivering disclosures, particularly where they're not actually mandatory, where they're just preferred. But as I mentioned earlier, if you don't actually have a strategy on this, if you're not thinking about this at all, you don't have a strategy, it's something that definitely does require some thought and will pay dividends for companies that are forward thinking on this.
I think, Annie, you've just raised an interesting question in terms of, for all the reasons to do it, how do you trigger that action from the senior management in a private party? So I'll hand over to you to explain your thinking there.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, coming from quite a small VC funded private company, it can be sometimes fairly challenging to get senior management engaged with thinking about ESG commitments and strategy, and just getting them to think around where this needs to fit into their company strategy and when they need to be talking about it. So I guess a real practical question, Lindsay, is when we start to develop these strategies in ESG commitments, where should we be displaying this as a private company? Should it be on our website? Should it be included in our investor decks? Should presenters be talking about it at conferences? Where do you see the most value of showing that we are forward thinking and including these things in our corporate strategy?
Thank you, Annie. Great question. And I will say this is not an issue specific to small VC companies. Even reasonably large listed companies have been saying, look, I'm struggling to get my senior management to pay attention to this, as important as it is. Yes, presentations, investor decks, websites, yes, and yes. Basically, ESG does need to be integrated into your strategy. It is part of strategy. It's not just where you're going to sell to, what your product is, how you're developing it. It's also how you're going to deal with those issues, which are increasingly important to stakeholders. A VC-funded organization, eventually your VCs will be thinking of an exit. Who are they going to exit to? At the top of the tree, it's going to be institutional investors. Institutional investors will want to see a coherent story on your ESG strategy. So yeah, definitely worth integrated into into all of those communications and into all of those interactions with stakeholders, and by all means telling senior management that, you know, this is valuation relevant, should help get their attention on that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Some good pointers. And I think it's kind of interesting reflecting on, you asked about the website. In that session back in June, where there was that discussion around how the private equity guys are asking consultants or themselves, they're just looking at company websites to make an assessment on the ESG credentials of the company and give them a rating unknown to the company. So it kind of reinforces how important the messaging, consistent and everywhere, probably is, which I'm sure the comms people on the call would say, well, of course it's important. Consistent messaging always has been. And in some quarters of our government, we've seen very little of it of late. So it'd be quite nice if we could get back to some good, consistent messaging. I'm conscious I'm about to call sort of last orders on questions. But Eva, in a very timely way, you put a question into the chat box. I thought you might also like to say something about your upcoming conference next week. I know ESG will likely feature there. So Eva, over to you.
Dropping me in it, thank you. Yeah, so brief intro, I work for Optimum Communications. Obviously, it hasn't chiefly been me as an ESG expert. We've got a lot of links to people who work in ESG at some institutions and so on. And it's an issue that we're very interested in that we recognise that, you know, people need to communicate it, and we work with small and big life science companies. So we're interested in it from that angle. So we've got an industry conference, mainly for smaller companies, people from the industry, some investors, a few media, Chatham House. It's something for discussion. It's on the 4th of October. It's virtual, mostly. We are having some drinks at the end in central London afterwards for anyone that dares, with a mask, I expect. I think it's noon to about 6:30. There's various different panels. It's on our website, and it's trying to discuss, it's celebrating the industry, but essentially every single one of our panels will be asking a question about the importance of ESG and trying to get different perspectives from leaders of companies, investors, both public and private, and that sort of thing. And then I had one last question, which was, and maybe you could argue that I should know this myself. I might have to go and try and look it up. Do you have a vague idea of sort of what relative size the pools of money are, I suppose particularly in Europe, of sort of self-declared, as it were, ESG-focused investors versus those who are not, you know, they haven't declared a specific interest or that they're going to try and measure up to anything?
Oh, interesting question. I don't have a handle on the exact stats. All I know is that it's trillions and not billions at this point. However, the thing about the ESG integration is that, firstly, investors are kind of voluntarily headed in this direction for quite a while, for at least the last 2-3 years, integrating ESG factors into all of their investments. We're kind of getting to the end of that phase, and now we're seeing statute come in. We mentioned the SFDR earlier. Certain other regulations, both kind of separately in the UK and Europe, are kind of pushing through on that. So let's say within this carries on for another 2 to 3 years, there aren't actually going to be any large investment managers that do not have some kind of ESG focus across their entire portfolio. So it's really starting to think about, because investors don't really look at what's happening presently, they're looking years into the future and thinking, what will this company be worth in a few years' time? It's good to think about things in terms of what will your company do within that world, when basically everything is ESG integrated, and when, you know, essentially it's no longer become a useful term to use. And that's kind of where we're headed to, I think.
Okay, thank you.
I think given that we're coming towards the end of the hour, I think that may be a good point to wrap up, in a sense. I think, Lindsay, thanks for a great journey through this. I think there was lots of insight there. And I'm sure on the FRC website, there will be lots more details and colleagues that could be connected with it. There's more specifics to follow up on some of those fronts. But thanks for your time on that. Thanks for all the questions. For me, I just think it's, you know, maybe what you mentioned at the end there was the ultimate goal here, is to get to the point where it's so taken for granted that ESG doesn't get spoken about. It's just part of what goes into the deal making process. And interesting there towards the end from James, you're saying you're seeing these quick up even in relatively small investment banks. You're seeing these questions start to appear. So I think certainly there seems to be the appetite, the passion, the drive, and probably the statutes and the regulation coming will help with that as it standardizes what's, I've seen described varying between. It's really key, and we're getting there, between some describing it a bit like the Wild West. So hopefully we're on the journey from the Wild West towards something that's more understood and applied. So thanks to everyone. It's been recorded, as I said, so it'll be there if you want to refer back to it. Thanks for your time this morning, and I look forward to catching up with you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.
And good luck with the award, Lindsay.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.